Welcome, everybody. This is the Friday webinar, and this is brought to you by the California chapter and the northern section of the California chapter of APA. My name is Libby Tyler, and I'm the ethics director for the northern section, and very happy to work together with the California chapter to present today's topic. The topic is Planning in an Era of Preemption, or subtitle, Your Plan Has Been Preempted. Perhaps that's been happening to you as well. I know it's something that I've been facing in my own work as a planner. This program was originally planned for a joint program with our annual ethics and law training back in March, and we all know what happened then. It was to be in-person training. I guess a positive is that we can now reach out to more individuals to listen to this very timely topic. And again, we worked with the California chapter in presenting this to you, and I'd like to thank Ben Morrison and Francine Farrell for helping us bring this forward. So on the next slide, we have information on getting your law credits for today's program. They've been accepted and they're now on your MyAPA for those seeking AICP credits. And the number is 920-1813. Or if you just remember to search under preemption, I think it's the only program in the remote learning that is on that topic. So that should be pretty straightforward. And there's the link there if you want to go that way. Next slide. Okay, this is just on the law topic. Usually we do both topics, but we do still have online ethics training available. This was a program that we did some months ago, and it's available through APA, MyAPA, until the end of the year. So if you still need your ethics training, this was a panel discussion on the APA ethics case of the year. And I've got the presenters there listed, and the number can be a little bit hard to search for, but 919-5109. Both of these webinars are completely free, and this is a great way to learn some interesting things as well as to get your credits. And that will link you, once you log into APA, it'll link you to actually a YouTube video, so you can watch the panel that was taped earlier. And I would like now to asked Stephen Velyvis to introduce our speaker, and Stephen also assisted in organizing this webinar, and he is the legislative director for the northern section. Stephen?
Thank you, Libby. It's great to have you all with us. I'm here today primarily as a moderator. I'm going to introduce our main speaker, Eric. Give you a quick intro about the speech and his presentation, and then I'll turn it over to him. So thank you for joining. Good morning to those in the Pacific time zone. Good afternoon to everyone else. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us. Eric Phillips is my colleague and partner at the law firm of Burke, Williams, and Sorensen in our San Francisco office. And he's also the Vice President for Policy and Legislation of the California chapter of the American Planning Association. Eric's law practice focuses in the areas of land use, real estate, and California Environmental Quality Act compliance. And he has extensive experience with myriad housing laws, particularly with the state density bonus law and the Housing Accountability Act. Before attending law school, Eric worked as a planner, and he's been working on planning issues in California since 2002. Eric's presentation today will look at some of the different ways state laws preempt local planning regulations, particularly focused on housing issues. California is part of an expanding national trend of rethinking zoning that is exclusively for single-family residences, and it already has some of the nation's most specific state laws regulating local planning. In addition to briefly comparing California to other states' planning laws, today's presentation will review recent legislation, including SB 330, the suite of ADU bills, the Housing Accountability Act, and the density bonus law that have limited traditional review processes. We will also cover some pending California housing legislation for 2020 and brainstorm about ways to craft planning regulations going forward. One final reminder before I turn it over to Eric, please type your questions in the Q&A area and vote for the questions you would most like answered. Doing so will raise those questions or upvote them to the top of the list. And I'll occasionally interject to pose the question to Eric for discussion, or we'll come back and visit some of them at the end. And so without further ado, Eric, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Steve and Libby, for setting everything up and for inviting me to speak today. I'll be happy to go through some of the topics that Steve just gave the overview of, and as Steve mentioned, in addition to having him jump in with questions as we go, I'll try and pause at specific points to circle back and make sure that we're getting your questions answered, because more than anything, we want this information to be of value to you, the members, as we're going through. But as we start, I did want to just provide a little bit of national context for the conversation that we're going to have, and for the types of state legislation that we are working to interpret and comply with here in California. So preemption can actually be quite a broad category. It covers things like rent control. There are lots of state regulations around short-term rentals, things like Airbnbs, wireless and telecom. There are lots of topics that states do try and regulate and take out of the local planning world. But today we're going to focus not on those topics, but specifically on state regulations that preempt the ability to plan for and regulate housing development. As you can see on this slide, where there's an illustration of the United States, the dark purple areas are states that were considering or had legislative proposals this year for planning related legislation and things that would preempt local planning controls in those states. In most places, apart from California, those rules are limited to allowing second units, or what we call accessory dwelling units and ADUs here in California, or limiting controls around aesthetics and design regulations, trying to make it a little bit easier for developers to come forward and have their plans reviewed and approved. However, although there are a number of states that are considering those types of laws, very few of them actually gain political traction or move forward in states apart from California, in areas, especially in areas of the South, in Texas and Georgia, Oklahoma, where there are still really strong arguments for local control that keep lawmakers from getting much ground in preempting planning regulations at the statewide level outside of California. So California, in many ways, is an outlier in the United States in terms of how it has already begun regulating planning, and in the types of legislation that it's considering going forward that would further limit the ability for local jurisdictions to make their own independent planning decisions. So as I mentioned, states in other parts of the United States are considering ADU laws, or things that would limit design guidelines application. But in California, we already have the extensive ADU laws, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. And we also already have the Housing Accountability Act, which limits how jurisdictions can apply subjective standards to planning projects. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. So California is already ahead of where a lot of states are just discussing about whether or not they should get there. And because we're ahead of the curve on that, we also get to see some proposals that would take it further here in California, increasing the default residential densities much more broadly. There's the density bonus program, and we're looking at ways of increasing density bonus. Another area where the legislature has been very active in discussions are ways to limit impact fees that are charged to housing development projects. So there's lots of things that are being discussed at the state level that could continue to restrict local jurisdictions' ability to plan for and control housing development. But there are some places that are looking at California-like regulations. For example, Washington State has a proposal in front of their legislature that would allow development of up to 12 units, depending on the size of the lot and the context of where it's being developed, on all properties, including single-family properties. In some ways, it's similar to the proposal that was part of SB 50 that was discussed last year and the beginning of this year before that stalled out in the legislature. Another common example is Minneapolis, which at the city level has eliminated zones that are exclusively for single-family uses. They permit triplexes on all residential lots, and rather than requiring some zones be exclusively for residential, single-family residential uses. Similarly, Portland, Oregon has ADU laws that are similar to the state ADU laws here in California. But those examples in Minneapolis, Portland, are city examples where individual jurisdictions have decided that they have the right market and the right sort of regulations to allow for more flexibility in residential development. It is, again, pretty unusual for a state like California, which is so large and has so many different markets and different types of communities, to set the rules at the state level at such a high level. So one thing I wanted to put a plug for in right as we're getting started is your ability to both remain informed and be involved in the state legislative process through APA California, both at the section level and the chapter level. We have policy representatives that review legislation. We have a very active legislative team that informs our ability to take positions on various bills. And we provide periodic updates both to that group and to the chapter as a whole. There will be an update to our chapter-wide platform on all of our legislation that is going to be discussed in more detail at our conference this fall. So it's another opportunity for me to plug that. Because of COVID-19, we're not doing our traditional fall conference where we're all able to gather in person, but there's going to be a virtual conference September 14th through the 16th that will still give us the opportunity to discuss and issues like this and ways that people are dealing with it, as well as the usual range of planning topics that are discussed. So hopefully you'll be able to join virtually for some or all of that event in the fall. And as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing updates to our chapter legislative platform that will inform the position that we as a chapter take on bills like the ones we're going to be talking about through the rest of the presentation today. So I'll pause for 1 second just to put an eye on the questions. It doesn't look like we have any that are specific to the setup, so I'm going to go ahead and dive in to the suite of bills that are somewhat preemptive of the housing regulations. And I'm sure this will trigger more specific questions that we'll try and circle back to. So the first area that I'm going to talk about are accessory dwelling units and ADUs. I did reference this during the opening remarks, but for the last several years, the legislature has consistently gone and made adjustments to, or sometimes wholesale reworkings of, this provision of the government code 65852.2 to limit a jurisdiction's ability to regulate ADUs. The animating principle behind this is basically anywhere where you allow or already have residential uses, the state is looking to have you also allow at least one, if not more than one, accessory dwelling unit. In addition to certifying, so there's a couple different ways that the state goes around, and let me back up. There's a couple of different ways the state goes about doing this. The first is that it requires all review of applications to develop accessory dwelling units be done with a ministerial process without a hearing and only applying the specific standards that you have in your ordinance. If you don't have an ordinance that's compliant with the regulations and the state law, then those provisions of the ordinance are null and void. You can't apply them, and you can only apply the applicable regulations that are specified at the state level. And during the fall of last year, 2019, the chapter put on a webinar on ADUs. It's still available on the chapter's website that gets into some really specific details about the types of things that you can regulate and can't regulate. So I'm not going to repeat all of that now, but we can certainly talk about it more if there's questions, or you can look up that other presentation for a deep dive into ADUs. But in addition to regulating the types of things that jurisdictions are allowed to control, the state law mandates that there are certain types of ADUs that always have to be approved regardless of the contents of your local ordinance. So if you have a single family dwelling unit that's either existing or proposed, the state law mandates that you approve either one interior ADU within that existing living space and a junior ADU, or a new freestanding ADU that can be up to 800 square feet and 16 feet high, plus a junior ADU, which is a smaller type of accessory dwelling unit. So under these provisions, you can get up to 3 units on just about any lot where single family dwelling units are permitted. They do have to be under common ownership for the most part, but they do create the opportunity for an individual homeowner or a single property owner to have 3 units that can be used for residential purposes. In addition, the ADUs have to be approved in connection with existing or proposed multifamily buildings. So in zones where multifamily uses are allowed and you have an existing multifamily property, the portions of that building that aren't used for residential purposes like parking spaces, storage areas, those kinds of things can be converted into ADUs. In addition, the amount of parking that can be required for ADUs is severely limited, as are the types of impact fees and the amount of impact fees that can be assessed on ADUs. So there's lots of different ways that the state has looked at controlling the restrictions that jurisdictions put on accessory dwelling units in an effort to promote that type of development. But let's pause here and hit a couple of questions.
Thanks, Eric. We have one question specifically about ADUs and Government Code Section 65852.2 C2B. And it's really, a question is, she's unclear whether the law allows local jurisdictions to, oh, where did it go? Here it is, to allow ADUs to be 1 bedroom or less. And so that's the specific ADU question for you.
Yeah, so it depends on the type of ADU. So for example, if you're developing an ADU that is under 800 square feet, the jurisdiction doesn't have any ability to really to regulate or deny that application if it meets the standards that are in the statute. And the statute doesn't specifically authorize defining a bedroom count within there. The state building codes regulate the amount of living area that are needed for bedrooms and for individual occupancies. And jurisdictions really shouldn't regulate beyond those building code standards because they run the risk of potentially violating fair housing laws or wading into other areas where they really shouldn't be regulating. So rather than focusing on the bedroom count within the ADUs, it's, I think, more appropriate to work within the square footage limitations that you're allowed to regulate under subdivisions A and E of that law.
Before we leave ADU, Josh is asking, since the ADU law seems to change so often, would you recommend local agencies, or would local agencies benefit from drafting and adopting their local ordinance, which in short just replicates or directs the applicants to the state law regs?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we'll talk more at the end about some different strategies that jurisdictions can do to try and keep up with these changes. But I do think that it does make sense for jurisdictions to adopt their own ordinance in this context. So it is frustrating that it becomes an ordinance that you have to update almost annually because of the frequent changes that the legislature enters into. But if you have a local ordinance, you can define more standards that might be important for your community. You have the opportunity to develop objective standards that can be applied in a ministerial process to help craft the way the ADU fits into the lot and the context of the community that go beyond what the default rules at the state level permit you to do or would control in the absence of having an ordinance. If you don't have an ordinance, you can only apply the standards that are specifically listed in the statute. But if you do have an ordinance, you at least have the opportunity to regulate a little bit more of the design and shape and alignment of ADUs. So I think it still is worth the effort if that's something that your community is interested in.
Okay, I just wanted to remind folks to please try to put your questions in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. It's a little hard to monitor both, so thank you. We have other ADU questions. Should we move on, or?
Yeah, let's do a little bit more of the presentation, and then as time allows, we'll circle back. As I mentioned, the ADU statute is very detailed, and we did a full deep dive into each section of the ADU legislation last fall. So there is already material available for those really specific ADU questions. But I also know that it's an area of interest and that keeps coming up. So we can definitely come back to it as time allows later in the presentation.
Before you go, Eric, sorry. Someone did ask where they can find that more detailed ADU presentation. So
there's a link to the slide presentation for it. And I think that for the video itself, through the chapter's website, if you look at the, if you log into your APA account, you go to the chapter website, on the legislative page, it has legislative updates, and we did legislative update presentations on ADUs and also on SB 330, which are both posted and available for members to take a look at.
Thanks, Eric.
So I mentioned that ADUs are required to be approved ministerially, and that is a type of approval that limits a jurisdiction's ability to use discretion. There's supposed to be no judgment used or applied. You're just looking at an application and seeing, does it conform with the standards we already have on the books? And the legislature is looking at other types of projects that they can make into ministerial approvals. Another variation on that theme is what's called a by right approval, where the legislature can take a specific type of use or a specific type of project and say that that type of use or project is allowed by right in particular zones. So even if your zone would have said that a multifamily housing project would require a conditional use permit, if it's identified as a by right approval, then you as an agency are precluded from requiring a conditional use permit or any sort of other discretionary review that would constitute a project under CEQA. The difference between a by right approval and a ministerial approval is that the by right approval concept specifically allows for design review, provided that the design review really is limited to design issues that don't trigger CEQA review. They're not allowed to constitute a project under CEQA. So basically the discretion that you have over the project is very much limited, and you can't change the project in a way that would mitigate environmental effects. Therefore, it doesn't need to be subject to CEQA. The most notable type of ministerial approval that is currently in state law is SB 35. So SB 35 defines a specific class of projects that are eligible for a streamlined ministerial review and approval process. As you can see on this map of California that's showing on the slide, almost all of the state is subject to SB 35. Each CD makes annual determinations on how jurisdictions are doing on housing production compared to the RENA allocation that they have. And depending on how much progress you're making towards your RENA allocation, your jurisdiction can be subject to SB 35 for projects that either provide 10% of their units for affordable housing to lower income households or 50% of their housing for lower income households. And again, that threshold varies based on where your jurisdiction is in terms of its housing production targets. To qualify for SB 35, there's a long list of specific site criteria that are meant to screen out potentially environmentally damaging projects, because as a ministerial project, SB 35 projects would be exempt from CEQA review. The other key part of SB 35 is that through the ministerial process, the jurisdiction is only able to apply its objective development standards. And we'll talk a little bit more in just a bit about what that actually means and what those standards look like. But you might have standards on your books that you can't apply to an SB 35 project when you're reviewing it. Some examples of by right approvals that I wanted to highlight are featured here on the slide. The first is for sites that are used in your housing element to accommodate your RENA but require rezoning. When those sites are rezoned, they're required to allow multifamily housing by right, as long as the multifamily housing has at least 20% of its units reserved for lower income housing. So again, if you have these sites that you are looking to use in your housing element allocation to meet your RENA, but you need to rezone them, they have to become by right without conditional use permit, and they won't be subject to subsequent environmental review under CEQA. Another whole category of projects that have been defined as a use by right is supportive housing. The Supportive Housing Act lays out specific criteria in terms of affordability and amount of services that have to be provided in connection with supportive housing in order to qualify for by right. But once you meet those thresholds, it becomes a by right use in any zone that allows multifamily or mixed use. So no additional conditional use permit or environmental review would be required for those by right approvals. I'm going to go from here to talk about SB 330, but before we go on, I want to pause and see if there's any other questions that are worth circling back to now.
There's a few. The most upvoted question is asking for some more information and maybe an illustration of a design standard before and after, meaning one that's transformed from an objective standard to from a subjective standard to an objective standard. You said you were going to touch on that a little later. I don't know if you want to do it now or.
Yeah, we can jump ahead to that to talk about it for a little bit. So the way objective standards are defined, and this is true for SB 35 and also for the Housing Accountability Act, is that it has to be a standard that involves no personal or subjective judgment, and it has to be uniformly verifiable. So you have to be able to look it up and know whether or not your project complies. I think the easiest examples of objective standards are things like height standards, setback standards, things that you can specifically measure. You can look at a plan set and tell whether or not something complies. When you have subjectivity in your standards, they won't meet this test. They can be things that you probably actually have in most of your zoning codes. One that I've seen used before is that you have to take special care to avoid obstructing views, or the site shall be designed in a way to preserve the privacy of adjacent residences and existing users in the area. But there's no real way to look up and measure to see how is my view obstructed? Have I taken a special care? Have I preserved privacy with the screening that I've added to my project? It takes a subjective judgment from a planner or a decision maker to decide whether that standard has been met. So those wouldn't be effective standards under this threshold of objective standards. What I think works better are more performance-based standards. If you know that you have a hillside area that you want views preserved from, then talk specifically about the angle from the curb line to the roof line that a building has to maintain and build within to define the building envelope. Or if you're concerned about privacy, talk about specific setbacks and stepbacks that can be measured from adjacent property owners and adjacent uses with very specific landscape standards that talk about the spacing between plantings, the height those plantings have to be, so that an applicant who is coming forward with their project can look up the code and tell in advance whether their proposal is going to be something that satisfies the city's goals or not. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the context of the HAA as well.
Okay, I think you can go back to your presentation. I'm monitoring the questions, and we'll bring them up when they're appropriate or at the end, the ones that we haven't answered. So thanks, Eric.
Great, thanks. So the next area that we'll do an overview of is SB 330. As I was mentioning when we were talking about ADUs, this is another topic that you can easily fill an hour-and-a-half webinar just on this bill. So rather than get into a lot of detail, I will refer people back to the presentation that we did. It was December of last year. It's also available on the chapter's website that breaks down each individual section of SB 330. But for purposes of our conversation today, I think it is still worth highlighting some specific aspects of it. So SB 330 was adopted last year. It's the Housing Crisis Act. It's in place for 5 years, and it has two main components. It has one set of regulations that consist of the Housing Crisis Act itself. It's codified in Government Code Section 66-300, and it only applies in what's called an affected city or county. SB 330 also contains a number of statewide changes that apply everywhere. That's kind of the second category of regulations, and we'll talk about those next. But for right now, the main part of the Housing Crisis Act, what's in 66-300, only applies in affected cities and counties. Right at the beginning of this year, HCD released a published list of all cities that are affected cities, or all cities and counties that are affected by SB 330. It's based on census designations, and most cities and more developed areas of the counties do count as affected cities and counties. So it's worth consulting the list, but if you're listening to this webinar, my guess is that you probably also are in an affected city and county. And when you're in an affected city or county, there's specific limitations on housing that you're prohibited from enforcing or adopting. So the main one is that there's no residential downzoning or adoption of standards that would reduce residential capacity permitted in these affected cities and counties. So what that means is that if you currently have a parcel that allows development at 30 dwelling units an acre, you're not allowed to downzone that to only allow 15 dwelling units an acre, or to adopt development standards that would make it impossible to develop at that 30 dwelling units an acre. There is a limited exception where if you upzone somewhere else in the jurisdiction to balance out the lost residential capacity, with HCD approval, you can do the downzoning, but in most cases, and probably as a practical matter, you won't be able to do residential downzoning of lots that already allow housing or residential development. Likewise, rules around adopting a moratorium have been curtailed. It's already kind of a narrow range of circumstances where you're allowed to adopt a moratorium, but under SB 330, has to be an imminent threat to health and safety of people, of life, and HCD has to approve the moratorium before you adopt it if you're going to try and enforce a moratorium against residential development. Any design standards or development standards that are adopted going forward, at least for the next 5 years while SB 330 is in place, can't be enforced unless they are objective standards. So as we were talking about, if you're updating your zoning code or your general plan now, make sure that you are evaluating standards for expressing them in a way that would be objective, that you're being, really, it ends up having to be more prescriptive rather than allowing flexibility on the back end, so that you can define standards in advance. Someone can look it up and know whether or not they meet the standards or not. The last significant limitation is that growth control measures are preempted from being enforced while SB 330 is in place, with a limited exception for certain jurisdictions in agricultural counties with voter-approved growth control measures that were in place before 2005. But other than that narrow exception, growth control measures are preempted by SB 330 while it's in place. And it's important to note that SB 330 includes explicit language saying that it not only keeps city councils and boards of supervisors from adopting or enforcing these types of regulations, but it also applies to voters' initiatives and referenda. So a city council can't take these actions. Likewise, the voters who live within the city can't put forward a set of regulations and vote to approve them if they violate SB 330. And then the last thing that I'll mention that you really need to be mindful of when you're processing applications in an affected city or county is that it has pretty strict replacement housing and relocation requirements. So anytime a project is proposed, anytime a new residential project with two or more units is proposed, you have to look and see if there's existing housing on the site where that new residential project is being proposed. And if there is, the new project has to replace at least the same number of units, and there's also new affordability requirements that get attached based on the characteristics of the units that were being demolished. So if the units that are being demolished were subject to rent control, were subject to recorded restrictions that limited or that required affordability, or that were just occupied by households that were lower income households, then the replacement housing has to replace those units in kind as well. And if you don't have information about the actual affordability or the actual income levels that were in the housing that is being demolished, there's an index that's referenced in the statute. That it's a HUD maintained index that looks at the percentage of lower income households in your jurisdiction, and you apply that percentage as a default as a proxy if you don't have actual income information to require replacement affordable housing obligation.
Here are a couple quick questions.
Sure,
they're at the bottom of the list, but they're specifically on SB 330. So first was, can old non-objective or subjective standards still be enforced? I think it's in response to your bullet point saying no newly adopted design standards.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So yes, standards that were in place that you already have on the books, you can continue to enforce them even if they're subjective, but there's a couple of important limitations on that. One, if you're dealing with an SB 35 project, only objective standards can be used to review that project. So you can't use your existing subjective standards for SB 35 projects. When we get to the Housing Accountability Act, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can only deny a project or reduce its density based on objective standards. So you can still use your subjective standards when you're considering conditions of approval and the way that you might craft a project approval if it's a project that has discretionary review, but you can't use those as a basis to deny the project or reduce its density.
Thank you. You answered another question, which was essentially if a jurisdiction's not in an affected city or county under SB 330, do other parts of SB 330 or SB 35 prohibit the jurisdiction from using subjective design standards? So I think you answered that one as well.
Yeah. And then we'll also talk about the statewide changes that apply to all jurisdictions under SB 330 next.
Thank you.
So that's a good transition. So the topics here that are summarized on this slide apply to all cities and counties in California, regardless of whether you're on the list of affected cities and counties that HCD has published. And the first statewide change is early in the development process. It's a new preliminary application process. There's a new section in the government code. It was added to live within basically the Permit Streamlining Act. It's Government Code 65941.1. And the preliminary application statute lists 17 specific types of information that a project applicant has to provide as part of a preliminary application if they want to avail themselves of the preliminary application process. So a preliminary application is an optional opt-in step that a developer can take, but there's a big incentive for them to do that. By providing all the required information, to demonstrate that they have a preliminary application ready to go from the date that they turn in a complete preliminary application and pay the development fees associated, the development review application fees associated with that preliminary application. Then the jurisdiction's development standards and its fees are vested or frozen in place as of that date. So there's not a specific approval or action that is triggered on the city or county's behalf. They receive the preliminary application, and then from that date, if it's a complete preliminary application, it's a self-executing part of the statute that the development is the beneficiary of vested standards and fees. And the fees that freeze aren't just the jurisdiction's fees, they're also school impact fees and other public impact fees that might be assessed by other public bodies, not the city or county that's reviewing the application. So it's a pretty powerful tool for a developer to use. However, it is an opt-in tool. They don't get it automatically unless they turn in the information required under this section of the statute. And the statute does say that jurisdictions are supposed to adopt a preliminary application form to give guidance to developers. But for anyone that hasn't done that yet, HCD has published a master preliminary application form that can be used. And again, because the statute is so prescriptive about what can be required, using the HCD form is probably just as good as developing your own, or adapting the HCD form to your own use would make sense. Once you've submitted, a developer has submitted a preliminary application, they have 180 days to submit their their first attempt at a complete development application. And once their development application is complete, at that point, any historic determination about the value of historic resources or a project's place in a historic district has to be completed. The application review then proceeds more or less as normal. However, as I mentioned, you have to make sure that you're applying the right standards to the project. You have to be applying the standards that were in place when the preliminary application was turned in. So if your jurisdiction adopted new design guidelines or zoning code amendments in the intervening time, those don't get applied to the new project. But it's important to do a full consistency review of the project as you're reviewing it. It proceeds to the hearing process, assuming that it's a discretionary review period. But SB 330 has a strict limit of 5 hearings for projects. So, and that's inclusive of all of the types of hearings that you might want to subject a project to. So once the project is complete, any study session, any preliminary hearing in front of the Architectural Review Board that then makes a recommendation up to the Planning Commission, any Planning Commission hearing, any continued hearing, and any appeal of the Planning Commission decision up to the City Council or the Board of Supervisors counts within this 5 hearing limit. There's an exception. So if the project requires legislative approvals, if it needs a zoning change or a general plan amendment, the hearing limitation doesn't apply. But if it's already consistent with the objective standards that are on the books, then the hearings are limited to, again, only 5 once the project application is complete. So it's something that we'll talk about more in a little bit as well, but it's really important to take a look at your hearing process, your development review process, and make sure that it is scheduled in a way that can accommodate this restriction. And then finally, if the project is not approved, it could be subject to judicial review under the Housing Accountability Act, which we'll talk about next. But before we get there, let's pause and hit on questions here. You're still muted.
Sorry. Let me just find it. There was a pretty good, must have been upvoted while I was trying to read it. Is the 5-meeting limit, does it only apply to projects that are Housing Accountability Act compliant?
Yeah, so you have to, the hearing limitations apply to residential projects that are consistent with your objective standards. So as I mentioned, if you need legislative approvals, zoning changes, then those can be subject to the traditional hearing and review process.
Hold on, let me just find this. It must have been uploaded. Give me 1 second. Is there a timeline for the city to review and respond to the preliminary application? And does the response from the city have to be in writing?
So the preliminary application doesn't trigger an obligation on the city's behalf. Again, the assumption is that the application is complete, and once the items have been turned in, the vesting kicks in. It does not require review or response from the city or the county to confirm that everything has happened. I think it's a good idea for the city or county to review and see if there's any missing information that would be required to kick off the vesting, and they should communicate that back. Best practice is to do that in writing so that you have it a record, so that you can be really clear what the right date is for when the vesting would begin. But there's no affirmative obligation or specific determination that the city has to make that the preliminary application is complete. So that's different than when the developer turns in their full development application and the Permit Streamlining Act applies. Then the city or county has 30 days to review that information and evaluate it for completeness using its own standards for what information is required to process the development application at that point.
Thanks, Eric.
So as I just mentioned on the last slide, if a project is not approved, it could be subject to the Housing Accountability Act. So the Housing Accountability Act is part of the government code at 65589.5, and it applies to all housing development projects and emergency shelters. So that means affordable projects and market rate projects are protected by the Housing Accountability Act, as long as they're proposing residences, transitional and supportive housing, or mixed-use projects. And to qualify as a mixed-use project, 2/3 of the square footage of the project has to be designated for residential use. But as we were talking about earlier in the presentation, if you have a housing development project and that project is consistent with objective standards, the city or the county is not allowed to reduce the density or deny the project unless it makes really specific findings about an adverse impact to public health and safety, and the fact that there would not be any other way to mitigate that impact except by reducing the density or denying the project. So it requires cities and counties to be very careful in their review of projects and make sure that any basis that would potentially reduce the density of an application or that would result in its denial is based on a specific objective standard that meets this definition that we reviewed a little bit earlier. Steve, did you want to jump in with some questions?
I think the answer, if you go back to the previous slide, is there, but I wanted to confirm, would an application that concurrently proposed single-family development with ADUs be considered a development project? And I think since all of that is residences, it would be.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think that there's a good argument that the way it's written now, because it says residences, if someone was proposing just one single family unit, that wouldn't meet the definition. But a single family unit plus an ADU or multiple residences that would be protected. And certainly a subdivision with multiple single family units or multiple residences, that would be protected. really the only interpretation that I think is reasonable would be that if it's just one single solitary home without an ADU, then it's not residences that would be protected here.
Thanks.
And we spent some time on this earlier, so I won't do too much repetition on it, but I just wanted to reinforce the idea that the key when you're reviewing projects under the Housing Accountability Act is to make sure that you've identified objective standards that apply. There is still, I think, the opportunity to craft conditions of approval that approve the project and preserve the density that is permitted or that the developer proposed and is permitted. That could be based on subjective standards, and it's necessary to make findings that your project is consistent with the general plan. If you need to impose conditions of approval to make a project consistent with the general plan, even if it's not based on a purely objective standard, to me that seems reasonable as long as it doesn't cross the line into reducing the project's density or denying that project. It's also important to note the various different ways that a project can be deemed consistent with city standards. I'll just go through this quickly and then we'll pick up some questions. So the first is that if there's substantial evidence in the record that would allow a reasonable person to conclude that a project is consistent, then a court can find it consistent. So if an applicant or a project proponent or a staff report explains why the project is consistent with objective standards, and it does so in a way that is supported and that a reasonable person could conclude that it was correct, it's not just a blatant error, then a court would be able to find that the project is consistent, even if the planning commission or the city council had found that it was not consistent with the standard. Another important one is that a project would be consistent with objective standards if it meets the general plan standards, but the zoning isn't consistent with the general plan. So if you've updated your general plan recently, identified a historically commercial area for mixed use, but you haven't updated your zoning, an applicant can come in and point to the general plan standards that allow for residential uses and be subject to those objective standards rather than the zoning, which would prohibit the residential use. And it's important that notice of any potential inconsistencies is given and is given in writing. So there was a question earlier about the review of preliminary applications, but here, once the complete development application has been either deemed or determined to be complete, the city or county has to give written notice of any potential inconsistency within either 30 days or 60 days of that completeness date. And if it doesn't do that, any standard that wasn't identified would be deemed consistent by operation of law, even if it doesn't actually comply. So there's lots of different ways that a project could be found to be consistent, even if it doesn't perfectly match your standards. So you have to be really careful while you're reviewing the project.
Just a couple quick questions that were on the topics you discussed in the last few minutes. What if a jurisdiction adopts standards such as objective design standards after submittal of the preliminary application that would be more favorable to the applicant? Can those newer standards be applied in that case with the applicant's consent?
Yeah, I think that so SB 330 has some savings language that allows for adoption of new standards that facilitates the construction of housing, so that if you revise your code and make it easier to develop and the applicant agrees that it's easier and wants to use those new standards, that would be okay.
And then does a preliminary application need to be submitted? You noted it was optional. Does it have to be submitted to limit the number of hearings under SB 330?
The hearing limit would apply even if the preliminary application isn't submitted. The trick is that the project wouldn't get the same vesting benefits if it doesn't submit that preliminary application, but the other Housing Accountability Act protections and the hearing limitation would still apply.
Thank you.
And then the last area that I'm going to walk through here is the state density bonus law. So Government Code 65915 identifies a series of project benefits that developers can claim if they provide certain amounts of affordable housing. And a project that complies with the density bonus statute is able to get bonus units, it's right there in the name, reduced parking standards, incentives and concessions, and waivers. And we'll talk about those in just a little bit more detail because they're really important. But collectively, what they mean is that it provides another opportunity for a project to deviate from standards that are established either in the zoning code or the general plan, even if they're objective standards. And the Housing Accountability Act, SB 35, all defer to density bonus and say that if you are modifying development standards under the concept of state density bonus law, you won't be found to be inconsistent with objective standards that otherwise apply. Those standards are no longer applicable to the individual project. And to get the benefits of density bonus, it's relatively low levels of affordability that are required off the top by providing just 5% of the base density of the project for very low income households, or 10% for low or moderate income households. You can get it up to a 20% bonus on top of that base density. Density bonus right now caps out at 35% for projects that provide 11% of their housing for very low income households, or 20% of their housing for low income households. Just as we talked about the demolition protections under SB 330, there's demolition protections under state density bonus law. You can't claim and be eligible for density bonus if you're demolishing housing unless you're replacing at least an equal number of units. And there's also additional affordability protections that apply to that as well. AB 1763 was adopted last year to increase the maximum density bonus that applies to 100% affordable projects. And by default, these projects are allowed to get an 80% increase over maximum density. And if they're within half a mile of a major transit stop, then their density is entirely decontrolled, but they get only a 33-foot height increase above the otherwise applicable height limitation. But then within that building envelope, the density isn't regulated and the project can propose any number of units that make sense for its funding and the market that it's trying to serve. But as I mentioned, the incentives and concessions and waivers are particularly, I think they're particularly interesting, but they're particularly a challenge for projects that are trying to, or for planners that are trying to make projects consistent with their plans, because they give the ability to the project to modify development standards. Incentives and concessions are generally related to development standards that reduce cost. So a project can get up to 4 incentives and concessions depending on the level of affordability that it provides. And it can modify development standards that result in identifiable and actual cost reductions. And the cost reduction provides for affordable housing costs or rents. So if the developer can identify reduction of an open space standard, or reduction of a parking standard, reduction of an on-site storage standard, things that would save construction costs, and that those costs then are used to provide to close the affordability gap and provide for the affordable units within the project, then they're entitled to those incentives and concessions, and the city would actually have the burden of proof to deny an incentive or concession if it thought that it weren't warranted. A waiver is another modification that a developer can request, and it doesn't have an economic component. It's strictly limited to the physical aspects of the project. So any development standard that would physically preclude construction at the density that the project is allowed to build has to be waived. So in other words, if I have a project with a 35% density bonus and the project can't fit those units within the height limit, then the height limit has to be waived to accommodate the additional density that the project is entitled to. There's a case describing this. It's Woolmer versus City of Berkeley back from 2011. And it has language that's very favorable to the developer's viewpoint of this. It says standards must be waived that physically preclude construction of a housing development that meet the requirements for density bonus, period. And it basically goes on to elaborate to say that physical impossibility isn't necessarily the standard. You can't require a project to strip out all of its open space or recreation or amenity area to cram units in and try and get it to conform to the existing development standards. You have to allow the reasonable project as it was proposed and modify standards accordingly to accommodate that. So I'll pause here again. The next section I'm going to go through is all focused on pending legislation that will change some of these rules. But before I do that, let's see where there are some questions.
I can't find it now, but I remember because it was a good question, or at least a good suggestion. Can you give some examples of what would be proper findings to deny under the density bonus law for impacts to health and safety? Yeah,
so the health and safety impacts that are cited under density bonus, and they also come up under the Housing Accountability Act, are incredibly difficult to actually make correctly because they refer to existing health and safety standards that are written. So, but if you do have a specific health and safety standard, say about like fire codes or specific materials that have to be used to ensure that the building has a particular fire rating, then you wouldn't be obligated to approve a concession to change those materials, even if it saves the developer cost, because you can point to a specific standard you have adopted that requires the use of that specific material for a specific life safety reason to prevent catastrophic accidents or deaths in the event of a fire. But things like that, where you have specific standards that are related to health and safety issues, and that, again, you have actual policies on the books, are able to be used as grounds for denial. But they're pretty strict and prescriptive findings and aren't often able to be made correctly.
One more here. Under the Housing Accountability Act, would jurisdiction be required to apply the most generous density if what's allowed is a range, or could the jurisdiction apply the low density at the low end of a permitted range?
So that's a good question, and something that I did want to highlight is that it's the top end of the range in the general plan is the range that controls for SB 35 and for density bonus. So if you have, exactly in the example that you just gave, a range of 25 to 50 units that are allowed at your general plan, and then you carve that up a little bit more specifically in your zoning, where you say in this part it's going to be 25 to 30, and this part it's going to be 30 to 40, and in this part it's going to be 40 to 50, that entire area designated in the general plan can look to the density bonus statute and use 50 as its base density and jumping off point to modify. So that's something that we'll talk about right at the end when we're looking at things jurisdictions can do. One is to put more detail in your general plan and delineate tighter band so that you get the density that you want to see. If you have these permissive zones, you're going to end up with projects at the high end of the zone.
Okay, we've got 20 minutes left, so let's move on. Thanks, Eric.
The next parts are a little faster. I'll do the pending legislation a little more quickly. We'll revisit it at the conference to see what actually got approved and not approved. But I did want to highlight folks, some of the changes that are related to what we were talking about today. So there's two bills, AB 2345 and SB 1085, that are both proposed to change density bonus. They would increase density bonuses to either 40 or 50%, depending on the proposal, and change the amount of affordability that's required to get incentives and concessions. 1085 also goes so far as to prohibit impact fees on the affordable units and the bonus units that are being added. So there would need to be some reconciliation between these two bills, but there could be even more opportunity for projects to modify standards compared to what's on the books currently. AB 3107 and SB 1385 are two bills that would allow multifamily residential development in commercial zones and commercially designated areas of a general plan. So basically the idea would be to override commercially exclusive zoning and only and allow as a use by right multifamily development in these commercially zoned areas. There's some different standards within them in terms of how much height and density and what other development standards would apply. So again, there'll have to be some reconciliation between these two if they move. But the core idea is that jurisdictions wouldn't have the ability to have exclusively commercial zones. And then finally, there's a host of upzoning proposals. SB 1120 and SB 902 both take elements of what had been in SB 50. SB 1120 would require ministerial approval of duplexes in all single-family zones and would require ministerial approval of lot splits to create two parcels on single-family parcels when certain criteria are met. To me, this isn't actually that big of a change considering the ADU laws that are already in place that we can have, in many instances, up to 3 units per parcel already. But this would create another housing product type that could be developed by right. SB 902 allows for intense upzoning of 10 units per parcel in transit-rich, job-rich, and urban infill sites. But here, it's not a mandatory program. It's something that it gives cities and counties the ability to opt into and adopt their own ordinance if they want to do the upzoning. And it creates a CEQA exemption for the upzoning of projects that meet standards that are defined in the bill. So it gives a little bit of control for cities and counties to decide where and how those projects would develop. And then AB 725 and AB 3040 are changes in the housing element process, again, with the idea of encouraging jurisdictions, or in some cases requiring them, to move away from single family only zoning, upzone single family properties for either 2 or more units or up to 4 units, and then be able to take credit for those for meeting certain parts of the RENA allocation that jurisdictions get assigned. So we've gone over a number of different ways. I just want to recap different ways that projects can preempt local planning regulations. So as we just mentioned, the proposed legislation would allow residential uses regardless of general plan and zoning designations in commercial areas. So that's a big one. But even apart from that, things that are on the books now, the general plan standards have priority over zoning, as we were just talking about in response to the question that Steve read, that if the general plan allows uses or allows a higher density, then the zoning allows the general plan controls, and the objective standards from the general plan would preempt conflicting standards in the zoning code. We talked a lot about how projects are subject just to the standards in time, the standards that were in place at the time the preliminary application was submitted, the difference between by right uses and ministerial approvals, that really take away jurisdiction's ability to attach use permits and conditions on a case-by-case basis for projects as they're being considered. And then the timing constraints we talked about as well. But I think to come up with plans that respond to this, it's important to really to plan for housing, to recognize that the legislature is looking for ways to boost housing production and to allow housing production and more different types of housing production in more places. So having a general plan and a zoning code that is prepared for that is probably the best way to handle it. And what I mean by that is having detail in your general plan. So as we were just talking about in response to the question that Steve read, is having more information in your general plans, I think it becomes an important tool. You lose the ability to nuance the different zoning gradations and development standards that as you transition from the general plan to the zoning that you used to be able to do. Everything gets kicked up to the general plan level. So in response, you might need to think about ways to have more detail and more information in your general plan to make sure that that's setting the table for the type of development that you want to see. Another issue is the planning to plan in a general plan. You can say, well, we want residential in this area in the future, and we're going to adopt a great zoning code or a really awesome specific plan to make this development happen. But once you designate it in your general plan for residential uses, someone can come in and invoke those general plan standards and not wait for the next plan to come out. So don't put it in your general plan until you're ready for it to be the law of the land in your city or county. If it's possible, adopt your subsequent zoning and specific plans at the same time that you put those general plan designations in place. Along those same lines is that it's just really important to be consistent. Your horizontal consistency and vertical consistency matters, because if you have references in your general plan to allow residential uses, those are going to get teased out and probably control over other conflicting policies that would discourage residential development in those areas. The other thing that we haven't really talked much about yet are how you could adopt either performance-based standards or form-based codes. So I think one thing that we're seeing is this reduced reliance on the Euclidean style zoning restrictions, where uses are strictly kept apart in their distinct zones, especially if the proposals to allow residential uses in commercial development areas pass, then Euclidean style zoning would really become a thing of the past. And what you should be looking for are performance-based standards that talk about the specific built environment that you want, regardless of whether it's a commercial user or a residential user, that would make your district feel compatible and whole and developed in a cohesive way that meets the needs of your community, and trying to articulate, again, those performance-based standards in objective ways becomes really the last tool that you have to control the way things develop in your community. Having said all that, even if you adopt great performance-based standards and form-based codes, those standards can be modified by density bonus through waivers and incentives and concessions. So to combat that, really the only two things that I could think of would be to have your zoning code be accessible enough and appealing enough to development that those standards aren't being waived and modified, or to build in incentives that complement the state density bonus law, so that if you know that it's really important to have a certain type of ground floor use or certain type of open space, offer more development in exchange for those specific community features that you want included, that become appealing to the developer and make them want to include those features that are important to you and your community, because they'll be getting more development potential back in exchange for providing those. It's also just really important to make sure that you've got application checklists and understand the full development process, so that you can respond to the timing deadlines and the limitations on the number of hearings that are included, and that you keep really good records about what standards apply to projects based on when they submit either their preliminary application or their complete development application, because there are penalties in the Housing Accountability Act for applying the wrong set of standards to a project. We're going to circle back. We have about 10 minutes for questions, but before we do that, I wanted to put in one more plug for the statewide conference. As I said, it's going to be September 14th to the 16th. Registration is now open. We'll be talking about these issues as well as any legislation that gets passed at the conference, as well as the whole host of usual planning topics. So it would be great to see you online at that conference in the fall. And now I will actually stop and go back to Steve for questions.
Wow, Eric, that was awesome. Thanks. And in true democratic fashion, I'm going to just go from the most voted questions on down. The winner is Amy's question. Should all CEQA documents essentially now assume 3 dwelling units for each parcel?
Yeah, that's a good question about how to consider your CEQA analysis. I think again, CEQA is going to be limited by the rule of reason. You want to have your assumptions be defensible. You don't want to over mitigate projects or identify impacts that don't really exist. But I think in certain circumstances, assuming that a single family area will develop with ADUs certainly should be accounted for in your CEQA process. And if you have information from your housing element or from data from building permits about how frequently ADUs are being developed in your community, that would provide a good substantial evidence basis for a factor that you assume would develop in a new project.
Or, conversely, for a finding that it's not reasonably foreseeable that, we're going to automatically get ADUs because only 0.04% of properties have them so far. So it's a great question, and something that will, I think, become, I don't know of a case that's addressed it yet, but I bet you we'll get one here in the next 3 years. So thank you, Amy. Heidi, hi Heidi, I worked with Heidi before. What if a mitigation measure was established for a no-build area adjacent to a creek related to a subdivision, perhaps at the initial stage for a specific plan? Can that no-build mitigation measure be preempted to allow for an ADU, provided the ADU comply with other state requirements?
So that's another good question, but the project development that is being done subject to a specific plan or a zoning code that was subject to CEQA remains subject to those mitigation measures. If there were specific areas that were carved out from development to mitigate the impacts of the project when it was approved, those mitigation measures should still continue to apply, just on the basis of the enforcement of that mitigation in connection with the zoning or the specific plan or whatever is providing the regulatory framework. There's no new CEQA that would be prepared when you do an ADU review application, but hopefully your MMRP from the original planning document has tracking involved so that you can compare new development applications to those mitigation measures and make sure that they comply.
Thanks. A number of participants have actually provided some answers to the questions, but I don't know if they're 100% correct, so I'm going to just keep going. Can an HOA and its CC&Rs prohibit ADUs? And the participant answer was no, pursuant to a law which was just approved and it becomes effective on January 1, 2020. Is that correct?
That is correct. So it's applicable to single family developments with HOAs. Those are preempted from enforcing covenants and restrictions that would prevent the development of an ADU.
Interesting question. Does the by right process allow for an appeal of the essentially ministerial mandatory decision?
Yeah, and especially if you're doing a by right approval process where you have a design review that's allowed, you can still hear appeals on the approvals. And it is possible that on appeal, a reviewing body would find that the original decision maker made a mistake or improperly applied even an objective standard. So it doesn't necessarily preclude appeals for by right approvals, but even on appeal, the reviewing body doesn't have the opportunity to require a use permit or impose conditions related to the use or operation of the property.
Can jurisdictions impose a monitoring fee on SB 35 projects to make sure they maintain affordability for the life of the project?
Yeah, that's not specifically addressed. It depends. If you have a jurisdictional-wide affordable housing program, like an inclusionary program, it is common to have monitoring fees associated with those units, and applying a similar monitoring fee, as long as it doesn't exceed the cost of actually performing that service and doing the monitoring, seems like it would be reasonable.
Can you clarify what type of design review process is allowed for by right projects? Can this be a noticed public hearing with findings made by a board or commission, or is it limited to staff level review of compliance with objective standards only?
So a by right project can have a noticed public hearing for its design review, but the design review is going to be somewhat limited. Again, it's not allowed to have as much discretion, the level of discretion that would make it be a project for CEQA purposes. Steve, I don't know if you want to talk about the McCorkle case, but we know that as long as the design review is limited to design issues that don't directly affect the environmental impacts of the project, that it won't be a project subject to CEQA. So you can have a hearing, but just be advised that the decision maker in that hearing is going to have their discretion limited. They can't reach out beyond the bounds of the design review to start controlling other aspects of the project.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, McCorkle is one of the more recent decisions on this CEQA issue of how much discretion means that your decision is ministerial or discretionary, and whether CEQA applies. And there is 2 cases before the California Supreme Court right now on this issue, both involving well drilling permits to determine whether they're ministerial or discretionary approvals, and thus whether CEQA does or does not apply. So I know one of them was just argued, and I think the other one is a companion case. So I would just really direct folks to watch for that California Supreme Court opinion, which should be coming soon, which I think, based on the oral argument that I watched, will be providing some clarity on that issue of is there a sliding scale of discretion for CEQA purposes, or is there a bright line test? So stay tuned on that. We've got 1 minute left.
Yeah, go ahead and pick, we'll do lightning round.
If sufficient access roads are not already in place on a property, can they be required when an ADU is being permitted?
Oh, that's more than a 1 minute question. So yeah, there are specific limitations to the types of infrastructure that can be required, and you're not allowed to go back and require correction of previous non-conforming uses and connections with the EDU. So it depends on the specific facts and circumstances that you're working with. That one's probably a little bit more detailed than we can cover. We did just want to highlight on the screen again the information to make sure that you get your Law CM credits for today's session. We flashed this right at the beginning, but if you join late, you didn't miss out. You get another opportunity here. And then we will also have this presentation. It was recorded today, and it'll be available online at some point so that folks can refer back, or also feel free to reach out with individual questions to us as the panel, and we'll see if we can help you out further that way. But again, thanks everyone for participating and for the great questions all throughout. It was great to have the engagement, even if it's a little funny to be doing it just on the screen, but thanks again.
Yeah, and just one of the participants asked what well drilling CEQA case I was talking about. It's power, protect our water environmental resources versus, I can't remember, some Northern California county. And there's a companion case regarding the well drilling permit in San Luis Obispo County. So you could go to the California Supreme Court's website and see, I think it's within the last month, the oral argument. So you can look at their oral arguments and find that case. So thanks everybody. Is there, who's wrapping up, or how do we wrap up?
I'll end the webinar right now. So great job, everyone.
Thank you.